So, coincidentally, I got this book in the mail. That wasn't a coincidence, I ordered it, but I got it in the mail on the same day that Bruce asked me to do a talk for this series. It's called Eutopia, James Gurney. It's one of my childhood favorites, and is a beautifully illustrated book with a very nice story, very well done, where a father and son get shipwrecked on an undiscovered continent in the 1800s, and on that continent, dinosaurs and humans not only live together, but they've managed to create a kind of utopia. And felicitous coincidences like that I often take seriously, because why else be alive? So I thought, well, I might find something of interest in here. And I'm going to use it as a kind of a foundation or a base for a couple of different points that I want to make. I don't know how much I'm going to actually return to the book. It'll depend on how this talk wends. But I would like to start at least with a quote that I found in it as I was reading it with my daughter. And for context, they are the father-son, Arthur Dennison and Will Dennison, are in their integration process. Basically, they're in a city where the library is, and Arthur Dennison is taking his evening walk with the head librarian as they are talking about, what Eutopia is and et cetera, et cetera. So Arthur is speaking here. "I can't imagine," I said one afternoon after a long silence, "how it could be possible for such a small island to support enough artists and stonecutters to build all these wonders. And I can't imagine how all these different people and dinosaurs can possibly get along without quarreling." "Oh, it is possible," said Nalab, who's the librarian, sucking thoughtfully on a mango. "But only if you do imagine it." So I'm going to use imagination and talk about imagination as a way of helping to distinguish between mental consciousness, display a bit of mental consciousness, and integral consciousness. Sort of my pet context setting for almost anything is the gradual, sudden transition that we're undergoing between mental consciousness and integral consciousness. What that means, why it matters. That's sort of, I think, the most important thing that's happening today on the planet in terms of human consciousness. And I'm going to use imagination to tease those out a little bit, and then talk about Eutopia with a U and Eutopia with an EU, which I think I'm just going to say good place from now on. Eutopia means a good place, or the good place, and good not in a good versus evil way, but good as a genuinely sort of transcendent sense of good. If you look at the etymology of EU, which I did cursorily before starting this recording, it's Greek. It means good, also means lucky or happily, but it also, there are deeper resonances as well with a sense of abundance, of overflowing wellness, let's say that, and it comes from the verb to be. So the traces in the etymology are something like Eutopia means place, which you probably know, and the traces then or the meaning has, the etymology has something of the traces of the meaning of this place of the overwhelming goodness of being, of the abundant well-being of being, of abundant well-being. Yeah. So this quote, I think, is an interesting road because it points to, or route in, because it points to a way that I think that we tend to hold imagination. We tend to think that imagination is talking about something that isn't real or that isn't here, whether we're talking about imagining a future or we are imagining something in fiction or in fantasy. There's this sense of imagination as being, or as talking about something which isn't real or isn't here. What that quote points to, when Nalab, I think his name is, when Nalab says, it is true, or it can be possible if you imagine it to be possible, is not only talking about something in the future, it's talking about our own present experience and how much imagination plays into what it is that we take as real and what our experience is. Our imaginative capacities, our faculty for imagination, are not something other than being present in the moment. They're a part of our being present in the moment. We don't have a mind. We don't have a conceptual structure without imagination. That's part of what it is to be human. And what that quote also points to is, if you're looking at something but can't imagine that it's the case, you won't see it. And if you can imagine something to be the case, it will change what it is that you see. It will change your experience in the moment, in a moment-to-moment way. So I want to talk about the good place and some practical notion of the good place, which I have, and possibly some of the ways of getting there, some of the practices of getting there. So then, as a way of initiating this little bit of an exploration of how I think integral consciousness relates to imagination and why that's an important thing, I'm going to use another quote which has just occurred to me that comes from, I think it's Molière, and I believe it's from Candide, although do not flame me if that turns out not to be the case. I'm not going to get it verbatim either, and I'm certainly not going to get it verbatim in French, so the subtleties of meaning might be a little bit different, but the quote is, we must imagine ourselves to be living in the best of all possible worlds. You could understand that, at least in English, as being, we have to imagine that because we don't, but we have to because otherwise, it would be insufferable to be alive. And I take it as being a little bit different, that in integral consciousness, when one is not, and when we are not, resting on this conceptual dualism that is a feature of mental consciousness, when we're not separating the past from the future in a final or real way, when we're not saying that what is true and what is imaginal are different in some final and real way, we are reawakening our capacity to anchor in the present moment a vision of what is good, without falling to some of the traps of mental consciousness, which we know quite a bit about from the 20th century. So the sort of ideological expression of something which is imaginal as being preferable to what is real, which has within it this kind of push-off or non-acceptance of what is real, of what is present, and which, has become the sort of, has itself become the tragedy and the trauma of the 20th century, and which we are still dealing with in our political life, both the inability to let go of that kind of utopia, because we need that vision, but the inability to really fully embrace it either, which leads us into this place of, the lowest common denominator. We're being pulled into a future that we are actively not wanting to be brought into, largely, I think, because we are not able to sit comfortably with our capacity to be able to imagine that life is good, that life is this good place, that it is already actually this good place. I'm going to start to filter this through, I think, some of the objections to the language can be that are sourced in mental consciousness. That affirming of life as being good with a capital G, that affirming of being in this good place, is not in some sense an ignorance of trauma or of suffering or of the reality of tragedy or any of these things. In fact, I would argue that that ignorance of what is present, of what is real, actually is an expression of imagination, that we have to imagine that something that is real is not, in order to push off of, at least conceptually, to push off of what is real, to reach for something else. It is not a, saying that this is the good place is not, again, a denial of practical reality or of necessity. That way lies spiritual bypassing, essentially, right? The fact that I break my leg and don't want to break my leg, the desire for a kind of feeling of health or an experience of goodness, and the moving towards that experience of health or goodness is not necessarily a way of denying what is real, or of only reaching for what is real, or being attached to a vision of what is real that isn't here right now. If we are rooted in that sense of this being the good place, I think it gives us a much more simple and natural way of navigating towards futures which are actually preferable. And in integral consciousness, one of the primary, let's say, functions or mechanisms of integral consciousness is, I think, to be able to see the future not as out there, but as to see the future as being something which is present. This allows us to select for a preferable future in a much more direct way than I think we can if we are simply imagining a future, projecting a future outside of us into into linear time and then trying to walk towards it. And the mode of being that brings about is very different from trying to know the future, trying to make the future happen, trying to predict the future, and looks more like being the future in this moment. There's a kind of time folding element to this, is a phrase that I'd like to use for that, where instead of walking along a path, I am generating that path as I walk. So with that conceptual substructure, which I'm going to be drawing on, I want to talk about a cultural form that I really love and that I think provides some hints for what a utopia, a good place, might be. And that's called a beguinage. Beguinage is an English word, but it comes from French. And in Dutch, it's beguinhof. And it basically is a form that started in the 1200s in the lowlands, here in Belgium, also a little bit in northeastern France, in the Netherlands, and then a little bit in Germany as well. And the beguinhofs offer, let me say what they are first. So beguinhofs were organizations, communities of lay religious women who were not nuns. They lived a secular life, but also a religious life. They lived a lay life, but also a religious life. And there are a number of things that I think are helpful for conceptualizing what a good place might look like as an actual place where you are living. And there are also just underneath why I love this so much is there are some interesting both ands that this form was an example of. So basically, a beguinhof, a beguinage, was a community of women. They would live in a compound, but that compound was not separate from the city around it. It was just, it was walled, but it was open at the same time. You had your own living space, or a woman had her own living space. So even your own house, it's not a huge house, it's not a mansion, but it's your own living space. You have your own kitchen, you have your own bedroom, you have your own house, centered around a church, centered around communal life, centered around a often very large communal space, as if living in a park. And, as I said, there are some both ends in that I think that are already interesting. It's intentional, it's religious, but it's lay. You don't have to take orders to live there. It's in the city, but not of the city, right? It's both in and cordoned off at the same time. It is communal, but it is also individual. You have a space for your individuality, but you also have the connection with the community and the participation in communal life. So when Bruce reached out to me, he did so actually on a Facebook post that I had made of a Facebook post that I had made 3 years ago or so. And I'm going to read it out a little bit and then kind of flesh out how I see this cultural form working today and why I think it would be beneficial. I wrote this post as an exercise in trying to condense what it is that I believed into 10 sentences. So it's kind of neatly organized in that way. Not all of it I agree with 100% today, but it's good enough. I believe that it's possible that a relatively small group of people create an organization, a way of organizing, being, and working with each other that helps to bring about a massive shift in how we structure human life and society. So a couple parts of that. The both-andness of doing work together and living together, but in a way that isn't just bound within one form. It's not an organization. If you think of like a tech incubator, right? It's a set of walls, a set of boundaries that help to create other organizations. I think of this often sort of flipped inside out from how we tend to think about the boundaries of an organization. I, as an individual, the way we think about it today, am in several organizations, and I prefer to think of those organizations as actually taking life inside of me. So inside of this beguinage, but not constrained by or bound to this beguinage, you have the possibility for many different kinds or many different activities within different organizational umbrellas that are synergized in relationship to each other. Perhaps perhaps 5 people that are living there are working in this organization, and 10 people are working in that, and this person is in this one, but also that one. So when we talk about, optimizing what it is, what our skills are, what our talents are, what our individuality is, and how it looks like, and finding the best places for that to plug in, I think conceptually what we're talking about is something that looks like this kind of a living, I wouldn't call it a meshwork exactly, but this kind of living a greenhouse for organizational and economic activity. Also, that both end this, that division, which in mental consciousness is solid, between being and doing, between economic activity and relaxation, between life and work, neither in the sense which we see a lot today of your life being dominated by your work, or the sense of those two things sort of being melted back into the same alloy, like it might have been before the mental age, but where your life and your work are expressions that reflect each other in relationship with this community that you're also a part of, in relationship with other people who are finding their unique voice in relationship to this panoply of different organizations that they might belong to, and that are taking life as being inside of themselves and of each other. I think that this shift is a transition qualitatively different than anything we have ever seen as humans. I think it is as momentous a shift as the emergence of human from animal. I think I'll talk about that later. I believe we have years, not decades. If we do not make a fairly significant leap much sooner than most of us realize, we are nearly certainly headed for a future none of us wants to live through, leave our children, or leave as our human legacy. And it's interesting that we can imagine all of those negative scenarios. I don't 100% agree with all of that today, but it's interesting that we can imagine those negative scenarios, or we can imagine a utopia, some kind of positive scenario, but it's really difficult for us to imagine what is present. The kind of transformation, I think, actually, and this is new for me, this is like this last week or two, but the kind of transformation, I think, is not necessarily, I am a different person, right? Or I become a different person, or I evolve into a different person, or whatever that is. It's largely, I wake up in a very different place than I thought I was. The world is a very different place than I had imagined it to be. Part of that process is just in noticing the way that you are imagining what is possible and what is not. But that has, I think as we start to gain a measure of mastery over that capacity of imagination, I think that starts to have us wake up into a very different kind of present, which is already here. If not practically, then in this space of reality, or in this space of being, however you want to say that. It is equally true that there is no one moment of shift, that the echoes of this will last beyond any of our lives, and that it's not something we can simply do. One significant aspect is a shift in the core psychological activity of selfing, releasing attachment to our symbolic virtual selves, and embracing selfing as a creative act. This could be called a shift from an egoic to an awakened orientation, though these are loaded terms. So I've been dancing around this a little bit. Maybe I will say it explicitly now, but a lot of the paradoxes of mental consciousness, I'll definitely talk about this later, but let's say the paradox of freedom, right? Where I'm free and you're free, and how do we negotiate those freedoms when maybe we want different things, right? I don't think that that's a paradox of freedom. I think that's largely a paradox of identity. And if we are not attached to the mental or the egoic form of identity, right? If we're not saying that the line between what I am and what everything else is, or the line between what I am and what you are, is finally real, is not constructed, but is just out there somewhere in the world. If we're not attached to that, the way that we create self, the way that we create identity, and what it is that we see as being true about what is real and who we are, looks very different. And that that difference, I think, is what integral consciousness is in at least one sense, where I am not I, the individual. I am that which is showing up as me-ness, as you-ness, as we-ness, as thatness, as all of thisness, where all of that is actually inside of my being. Not an inside that is opposed to an outside, but an inside that recognizes that here-ness of all of these different conceptual forms, and is able to play with all of these different conceptual forms, is able to be the place where these different conceptual forms is generated in a way that is fantastically creative. And I think we're, again, just starting to even sense the possibilities of this. On a societal level, I believe this is best captured. I'm back in my Facebook post. On a societal level, I believe this is best captured in words by a shift from scarcity to abundance, though those are also loaded terms. And I don't think I'm actually going to talk too much about that in this talk. These beliefs are not rock-solid convictions. They are more like essays, creative and evocative portraits. They are not simply statements about reality. Rather, they are ways of investigating and creating reality. My beliefs are simple, and hammering out the details of meaning and implication requires a great deal of nuance and complexity. And I think I'll talk a little bit about ways of investigating and creating reality towards the end of this talk. I do not think that this is utopian, or that any world, way of organizing life, society, or experience is or could be perfect any more than it is right now at this moment. Again, we're not imagining that a good place is a place where suffering does not exist, period, where tragedy does not occur, where life is not at times cruel, and where people are not ever cruel to each other either. Maybe that's a thing that lies far in our evolutionary future. It's not going to happen tomorrow. I don't think it is, at least. Maybe that's a limiting belief. I do believe what I'm alluding to is a world of flourishing where the human spirit is liberated in ways we can't even imagine today, and that orienting towards this world explicitly is a hugely important step, which is, I think, what is happening in this project and in this video. I believe this is possible. I believe this is necessary. I believe if you're reading at this point somewhere, you are deeply longing to bring this about. So I think this forum, this beguinage, is a place where we come together to practice, to live integral consciousness, to live as this kind of practice, as this process of integral consciousness, not in a way that is cordoned off from the rest of the world, but in the same kind of container that an individual creates in a personal practice, a way where you can start to self-generate an expression of integral consciousness, no matter where you are or what is going on around you. It's not a retreat. It's not a way of getting away from what is going on in the world around us. It is a sort of benediction of what is possible in life, of the goodness of life, and one which I think recognizes some things which we see more and more, understand as being true about what it is that creates a meaningful life, a good life. Some simple things like being in nature and having that resource to return to be able to go to. Some things is having support from the community that you're in, where your expression of self, your being, is no longer predicated upon the necessity of, in our system, selling your labor, right? Where you are taken care of, where you are supported and nourished in a way that is not necessarily a blank check, in a way that I think has a concomitant responsibility, but where you can actually relax into being held by the community around you. You're not going to get fired. I think it's a way of being that allows us to become tribal again, to be tribal again, without being only within our tribe or only identified with a tribe as defined by a small circle of people. But that does allow us to, I think, live in what is a natural cultural form for us in many ways. Now, there are differences in what individuals want. There are differences in what creates a sort of thriving sense of being for different individuals, obviously. But some of this is coded in our DNA. We were in tribes. We were in groups of hominids well before we're human beings, right? It's a couple of species at least in our evolutionary heritage. And I think we've lost the sense of what that's like. I think it's in there. I think it's hard-coded. I think we can find it again quite quickly. But you would be hard pressed to find in the modern world this kind of a tribe existing anywhere. We either live in very small and cordoned off, families, or dyads, or as individuals, or we're out in the big world. We're walking through Grand Central Station at rush hour, right? In the one case, we're entirely anonymous, and in the other case, we are, we are constrained by the smallness of that container, right? I think that would be a very different way of growing up as a child. I think that would be a very different way of participating in what is meaningful, right? When we talk about meaning and purpose in the face of the way the world is today, we often mean this great grand thing, this great accomplishment, this great, this great becoming of my final best self or something like that. And I think purpose looks very different when you're in a community, when you're in the kind of day-to-day service of each other's well-being and lives, and when that is an avowed part of the practice of being together. I think that looks very different. So that aspect of tribalness, that aspect of meaning, of purpose, that aspect of having a home, of being supported, and that aspect of being in nature, the aspect of being able to explore your individuality while also taking part in communal life. All of these, I think, are non-negotiable, essentially. I think that they're crucial, at least for the utopia, the good place that it is that I'm envisioning, and others, close to me as well. And I don't think that I'm alone in that, or that we're alone in that. I think that that's a very attractive form for many people. Now, again, the mental move is to sort of look for those people, draw the line around them, try to make that happen in the future. And I think what I'm talking about when I'm talking about binding through time is what, in some sense, what it is that is found there, the goodness that is found there, the abundance that is found there, is something that is emanating from this moment in time. It is here. I'm not rejecting life as it is. I'm using that sense of good, that capital G sense of good, as a way of navigating life as it is that it's happening. If I am never able to bring, something like that about, there would be a kind of disappointment, I think, in this being, but that disappointment would pale in comparison to the overwhelming sense of goodness and gratitude that I have just to be alive, to be given this opportunity to be given this opportunity to imagine what it might be like to live in a place like that. And if I were so focused on that future, I would be ignoring the places where it is happening in my life currently, where I do have the kinds of connections that I'm trying to bring about there, where I am able to give to my daughter something like what I hope that might sort of ideally look like if we were able to bring those forms about more and more and more, where I am experimenting with economic forms in a way that is neither merely economic forms and sort of personal and autonomous leadership in a way that is not merely hierarchical nor simply dispersed or distributed. So I hope that made sense. The last thing that I want to talk about are some of the practices that I think are necessary for bringing basically any kind of beguinage about, not just this one. So I'm kind of saying what I want, or how I want to live, where I want to live, the good place that I want to live and that I want to bring about. But what the practices of that place look like what do you need to do? Not like necessarily in the formal sense where I'm sitting down on a pillow and meditating, but in the same sense where my habits of identity that have been formed in my own life, in mental consciousness, are a kind of practice. There's something that brings about a particular kind of consciousness about. I have been touching on this throughout this talk, because I think the most basic one is continue to orient to the contents of your life in a way that is integral, in a way that is both and, in a way that recognizes this foundational fountain of being that you are, fountain of creativity that you are, the oneness that you have with that which brings everything into being, whatever that is, or however it is that you define that, that is not a separation that is anything other than conceptual. And that while that conceptual separation, that sense of I am different from what is outside of me, is important to be a person, to be a psyche, to be a self, it is a fiction. It is a way of, it is a creative act. It is a craft. It is not something which is final or ultimate or necessarily real in the capital R sense of the word. And I think that is necessary to catch ourselves again and again falling into the trap of reaching for the good place and not seeing that this is the good place. This is the good place now, and yet that recognition is, again, not a spiritual bypass. It's not to say my activity is unimportant in bringing the good place about. This is the good place, and the good place must be made. This is the good place, and we must move towards the good place. This is home, and we must create home. Home is perfect as it is, and we can make it better. Being able to sit in that conceptually, to sit in the kind of being that that framework brings about, to catch yourself, to watch yourself when you're not doing that, to hold the others around you as accountable to that, to try and interact with others from and as that place. I think that's basic. All of what I'm about to mention. And there are other practices, obviously, and there are other ways of looking at this. I'm not the only person to be talking about these kinds of places. And my focus, my focus is on the sort of small scale interpersonal practices, but there are important questions of structure and economy. There are important questions of the things that are practical that I don't tend to have my focus on, which is fine. That's not my, it's not my focus. But the practices that I'm going to name are what I call views. And a view, again, is in itself, I think, psychotropic and integrally psychotropic. A view is not a practice to get somewhere else. A view is a way of orienting to and generating an experience that then confirms that view, or then gives you a sense of, where that view is not quite being rested into or is being held. I was about to go in a different direction, but actually because of what this series is, and I'll experiment with this live because I haven't really considered this, but I think maybe the first view is something like life is good. It's an affirmation and continual returning to that experience of life as being good with a capital G, without which, why are we doing anything? Why does it matter what we do? It wouldn't. We wouldn't be able to reach towards something which is preferable unless there was the possibility of that being received. And in fact, unless that was not a possibility, but something which was a condition of life. The goodness and the recognition of that goodness, the ability to receive that goodness, and the ability to give from that goodness, the overwhelming abundance of giving of that goodness, I think is a view. Life is good doesn't mean life doesn't hurt. Life is good doesn't mean I don't make mistakes. Life is good doesn't mean my version of what is good is better than yours as a starting place. But yeah, I like that. Yeah, so I'll just offer in the explorations that I've done in the last 5, 6, 7 years a few views that I think are helpful in eliciting integral consciousness, out of which the good place emanates. The first one is that we are here. Anything that is happening here. I am here, you are here, and we are here. It's all real. It's all happening. We are free. It's continual returning to this expression of life as being radically free. Not a freedom that I have alone as an individual, although I have it, but a freedom that you also have, and a freedom that we have as a baseline condition for what it is that's happening, as a way of recognizing that whatever my behavior is, it is an expression of that freedom. It is an expression of that goodness. Not as a way of ignoring possible ill intent, but as a way of expanding what my sense of self and identity is to include what is real. We are light. Aware, conscious, we are love. And we are power. What it is that I am, what it is that you are, is not any different from that which is bringing all of this about. This is not a dogma. This is not a belief, right? It's not a way of saying what is real. It's a way of orienting to what is real and orienting from what is real. I can't tell you that we are power. I can't tell you that we are light. Doesn't mean something in the most practical sense, although kind of does. If all that matters is condensed energy, we are light. That's really interesting. As something to know, something to imagine to be true, something to recognize as being true. So these views, again, they're not practices in the sense of I'm going to sit down on my pillow and just do this. They're baseline ways of investigating what is reality between us. My bread and butter is sort of doing interpersonal practices. And in that process, what keeps pulling me forward is the sense of, is what happens when I am not bound as an individual, and the kind of co-presence of autonomy and community that happens in the relationships that I have that are the deepest and the most profound, where what is happening is not I-ness, is not you-ness, is not we-ness, is just happening in a way that uses I-ness and you-ness and we-ness as colors of this palette. And as that has deepened over the years, then that's not something that just happens in community with other people, right? That's a place where I come from as a being. That's something that is happening as the consciousness of this being in a constant way. Not always necessarily important to name or to point to, but is happening. Yeah. And then I often ask a question if I'm practicing these, which is, what is possible now that we are here together? Life is good. We are here. We are free. We are light. We are love. We are power. what is possible now that we are here together. Utopia, the good place, is possible because it's present. It's possible because we can imagine it. It's possible because we know what it's like. I think that's my talk.
Okay, so I'm at the train station with about 5 minutes. Clearly an ideal way to finish this place and way to finish the video off. And I worked myself into a bit of a state at the end of that, so I kind of forgot what I was talking about. I wanted to just contextualize the end of that a little bit. So those views that I was offering that have come up in practice with others are not the views, are not the practices of the culture that we're going to bring about. They're not the practices of the place. They're not the agreements that we need to make with each other to be able to, in a very practical sense, bring about the good place or manage the good place or work together within the good place. They're the views that contribute to awakened interbeing, and not just awakened interbeing, but a kind of what I call walking, talking awakened interbeing, which is not a phrase that I do like the phrase, but I don't think it quite captures what I'm going for. But awakened interbeing that is active in the world, that is an economic engine in the world, that is operating not just between us and interpersonally, but is a place where those lines between what I am and what you are, what we are, and what all of this is, are seen as being creative, as seen as being transparent to a certain extent. Out of that, and perhaps even to say the good place and that way of being as the world together with each other are different aspects of the same thing. Perhaps they are actually the same thing. That cultural condition of awakened interbeing and the good place, I think they arise together at the very least. And out of that place, that's where the practices like, let's say, speak the truth with each other, or whatever the sort of economic agreements are that we need to have with each other, the working agreements that we need to have with each other, they come out of that place. And I don't think that we can develop what those practices are outside of that condition of being that the good place is, outside of that condition of being that awakened interbeing is. I take that as being one with what integral consciousness is as well. I don't think we need to achieve something in linear time to be able to then come back and develop those practices. Obviously, there's going to happen, at least in linear time, in tandem. But that is to say, or the reason that I'm saying any of this at all again is I find that practice, that those practices, those views are, and what they reveal, what they're designed to bring about, are foundational. Not because they're simple, but because they are the foundation upon which those more, let's say, precise practices, I think, can come out of. So I hope that makes sense why I'm trying to tag this on at the end. Welcome to Ghent in Belgium.